It is time to go away from this snowy place to rest by a cozy fire on the beach and do the third episode, part 2 of Philosophy Talks with EcceFatum. Confucius is the philosopher we are discussing. The previous episode is on YouTube. You can find that. This will be the parts we didn't cover and then a little bit of extra stuff. Without any further ado, let's get Mr. EcceFatum into this conversation. What is up, EcceFatum?
Hello.
Yo, yo. How are you doing?
Doing good, how are you?
Well, it's been a epic week. I'm glad we got to get this session in before I go on holiday. This was basically the last chance. Nice.
Nice, yeah.
We had some funny wheel games.
Treat you nice?
Some of the time. It was a mixed bag. I think overall the wheel was kind today, except when it wasn't. I would say probably around 70-30.
All right.
Yeah.
So what's the thing you least like happening on the wheel?
Mouse sensitivity change.
Oh yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, it makes everything more difficult. Chat, can we get a confirmation on his mic level? Is it good? Sounds good to me, but I know it can be a little bit different on their end. Yeah, enjoying the last one. I see these notes are different. The assets are transparent this time, so we should be able to have more visual aids.
Yeah, I realized what I did wrong last time, so it won't be happening again.
No problem. Let's rock it and roll in it.
Yeah, so I first want to address the how to spell Confucius correctly, since we're commonly use the Latin translation, which would be Confucius as you have it written on. The original Chinese version would be Kong Fu Zi, which means Grandmaster Kong. Yeah, and then there's some other stuff from the last stream I'd like to address. First question was whether or not we can understand Confucius these days without the connotations from traditional commentary, and basically if it's possible to understand anyone in their time or if it's just our current reading of them. And I say it's really difficult to understand anyone these days, looking back at their times. But with Confucius, we're more so able to than with many other thinkers due to the fact that Chinese language has been consistent and there's huge amount of commentary on whatever he said. So I think we have a more nuanced idea of what Confucius was talking about back in his days than we have with many other philosophers.
Thanks, continuous culture.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to have a culture that is this old and didn't collapse at some point. There's been some smaller collapses at time, and we'll get into what happened when the communists took over, what happened to Confucianism then. So that was somewhat a collapse in Chinese culture, but they're getting back to those ideas on tradition, and basically Confucius thought is having a big comeback these days. So we'll get into that since we have some more time. Then the next question was whether or not learning about ethics would make people more morally upright. And there's some disagreements on this. Basically, one thing I found on the topic is that from all the books on philosophy, the ones on ethics get stolen the most from libraries. Which could say two things. Basically, people are interested in philosophy, they start stealing a book on ethics and then they don't steal again. or maybe it's just people that don't really care about ethics are still interested in it. Yeah, so that's your own interpretation
Wouldn't they
how
put
that
it back
works.
if they integrated the information?
Nah, maybe you'd think so. But maybe they think that they need to learn more and get more ethical in the process and just continue reading it until the morals really sit with them, and that just takes too long, so they keep the book at home.
There's a similar question that lines up with my educational background in brain science and cognitive bias. And you could phrase that: does learning about cognitive bias allow you to confront it more effectively and counter it? You could say it's kind of like scouting in StarCraft or filling Overlord vision, where it increases the chances that you can notice it, but it doesn't change human nature. You don't just learn about a bias and then you negate the bias. You still experience it. You can notice it earlier on and oftentimes catch yourself before you do something stupid, but it doesn't really change you on the foundational level. I
Yeah, I
guess
would
until you
totally
build
agree with
habits.
that. Basically, it's almost the same with ethics, that if you know how you should behave, it's easier for you to be aware of doing something wrong and to catch yourself in a process. But it doesn't make you more ethical as a person per se. You still need to think about it and act appropriately in a given situation. Then one thing that confused me a little bit as a comment, and I'm not sure, maybe you could speak about whether or not this is working or not. Basically, someone was confused whether I speak my own mind on things or if I was reflecting the philosopher's view. And I'm trying to make this as obvious as possible, but maybe I need to do a bit more there.
Well, this is one of the problems of having a live stream is someone can jump in while you're in the middle of a quote from Confucius, and it sounds like you are stating that as it is your position. So they'll make the assumption EcceFatum is saying this right now, therefore he believes Confucianism and is pushing it upon us, which is an incorrect transition. It's kind of tough too because it's a new format as well, so we will have some growing pains figuring out how to clue people in as quickly as possible. But I don't think there was anything that you were doing that was confusing. Like, if I'd been here with you in the full conversation, I was never confused about the difference between you quoting Confucius versus you stating your opinion. And I think by the percentages here, we tend to spend a much greater portion focusing on what the ideology is and was and the context of that rather than passing our own personal judgment or assessment. We do that sometimes, but the majority of it is kind of the spirit of laying the groundwork and let people think about it for themselves. Yeah, there
All
were
right.
some people last time who were confused and thought that you were actively proselytizing Confucianism, which I didn't get that impression at all. But
Yeah. Well, it's not the worst ideology, to be honest. So I think we in the West could use some notions of Confucianism, and probably Eastern culture could use some more Western influence to kind of balance it out. But I think it makes more sense teaching the philosophy of Confucius to a Western audience than it is to promote Ayn Rand, for example. And yeah, the last question, I don't really remember how it was phrased. It was how to implement Confucian thinking, and if it would have been good to kill all gentlemanly people just to get a better society. And I'm not going to address this directly, but we'll talk about the notion how to implement it. And Confucius has a direct quote on whether or not we should kill people to get a more virtuous society. Yeah, he's not for it.
let's not kill
Yeah,
particular
so
heathens.
yeah, would make sense. So basically, we talked about three things last time about Confucius. We did talk about relationships. We talked about the whole notion of being a gentleman. We talked about the Confucian virtues, which go into all of these. And what was the third one? Drawing a blank. Luckily, I still have the script. Learning and practice, yeah. So I didn't learn properly to remember that. Yeah, so these were the three core concepts we talked about last time. And to basically get people caught up that haven't seen the last one, or just to get back into the conversation, there's a short little YouTube video that kind of illustrates these three ideas and also goes into the two things we'll be talking about today, which is tradition and ritual, and his ideas on government.
All right. I have the video.
Who thinks that a black cat crossing your path of a morning brings bad luck? You might say it depends on whether you're a man or a mouse. China's Grand Master of Wisdom, Confucius, had little time for superstition. Instead, he taught that it was not the huge mountains on the horizon, but the molehills before your feet that would bring about your downfall. All philosophers and pupils, be greeted. It's Guy again, this time here to talk about one of the world's greatest philosophers and teachers, Confucius. Welcome to its history. Welcome to the world of deep thought. We believe Confucius lived between 551 and 479 BC. He was born in Lu, a province on the east coast of China. The area today is known as Shandong and was part of the German Empire between 1898 and 1914. In China, he is known as Kung Fu Tse, meaning Master Kong. While he was still a young whippersnapper, he turned his house into a school, not for money, but out of thirst for knowledge. In principle, anyone was welcome to learn history, poetry, etiquette, and ethics at Confucius's place. His fame grew as he moved his way through the government's offices, starting as buildings minister before moving on to justice minister, and then acting as chancellor of Lu. It was the perfect opportunity for Master Kong to test out the basis of his theory on just rule. Back then, individual Chinese feudal states were often at each other's necks, and almost as frequently at war. The Prince of Lu got caught up in luxury living and began to deviate from the foundations of government, much to the frustration of Confucius. So he handed in his resignation, packed his bags and headed off on a 13-year-long hike. We might call that a sabbatical these days, albeit a bloody long one, even by modern standards. After his long period on the road, the state of Lu wanted him back, where he resided until his death. Confucianism is the name we have come to use to describe the combined teachings of Confucius. But this is a Western concept. In China, they speak of Rujia, which means school of the learned. Confucius himself never wrote down a definitive work. He rather communicated his thoughts to his students. Most of what we know about Confucius comes from these notes, such as Lun Yu, a collection of conversations, statements, and anecdotes that are attributed to Master Kong. Confucius taught not only his own philosophy, but also collected old traditions and customs from a range of cultural circles that he wanted to preserve for posterity. Master Kong understood himself not to be an innovator, but rather a man to deliver and reinterpret the wisdom of old. At the heart of Confucian philosophy is practical direction on life and the self. It isn't a puritanical doctrine that directs its followers towards sacrifice and subservience to a deity, and there's no speculation as to the origin of the world. Confucius merely says that the world is there and it's there to support life. At the heart of his teachings is man, just as the later humanists described the importance of getting along with other people. It's not for nothing that Confucius declares his golden rule: do unto others as you would have done to yourself. The ideal person, described by Confucius as the noble one, sets an example to others both from an ethical and political point of view, so that others are inspired to emulate him. This person is true to the so-called 5 constants of Confucianism: humanity, rectitude, tradition, knowledge, and scrupulousness. There are further virtues that revolve around these core teachings and that you should demonstrate appropriately. If the normal person found it impossible to align themselves with the heavenliness of the universe, they could always just make the best out of their worldliness. Confucius always saw people as a work in progress, who could only become teachers themselves when they were aware of their own failings. Generate new knowledge while mulling over the old, and you become a teacher to others, he said. Not only did a person hold great worth, but Confucius also assigned them with great responsibility. The teachings of Confucius were multifaceted and even changed the political thought of Chinese rulers. The great teacher conceived of society in terms of the family. The younger brother obeyed the older as the mother did the father. The emperor was supposed to be the patriarchal master at the head of the family and rule the kingdom from high above his subjects. Like the sun at the center of the solar system, the ruler was to be at the heart of government, whose society in turn revolved around its actions and orders. This patriarchal hierarchy might appear out of place to the modern mind, but the emperor liked the sound of it very much. Confucius was convinced that strict order in life was absolutely necessary. The evidence for a lack of order was all around: warring states, moral decay, and chaos in the ascendancy. Confucius said that man could only exist as a socially organized being. For him, freedom was not suppressed by order. No, order created the space for human ability to act. If man is led by laws and obedience to them is enforced by the threat of punishment, he will try to avoid this punishment, but never be ashamed of his misdemeanors. If, however, he is led by virtue and adherence to decency rules his behavior, he will indeed be ashamed and ultimately turn to the good. In the face of chaotic political situation, the master called the leader of Lu and other functionaries in the government to return to the tried and tested bases of his social order. The government only functions when the prince is the prince, the minister is the minister, the father is the father, and the son is the son. The government was to remain true to the 5 constants, setting an example of virtue and rectitude and staying true to the traditional obligations. This is how Confucius envisaged it. To produce order in the state and maintain cross-societal prosperity, it was imperative that each person started with themselves. That would precipitate a sort of domino effect that would encompass all of the society, even the whole of the universe. To this end, people were to consider not just themselves, but also the entirety of society and the state around them. The rulers were to command not by force or law, but by setting an example to their people. As Confucius said himself, ruling means correcting. If a ruler does not act well, his decrees will be useless, because nobody will listen to them. Confucius advocated first and foremost the welfare of people. The entirety of his teachings can be boiled down to a basic collection of principles governing behavior and moral instructions. Harmony was always the aim, the golden middle, with everything in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Confucius always saw people in the context of the family, society, and the state, which gives his teachings political as well as sociological credence. Confucian theory has found its way into many aspects of life in the Far East, and in South Korea and Indonesia is recognized as an official religion. The great master lived in Bronze Age China, and you can learn more about the birth of the China we know today by watching our episode on that topic. Click here to access the video now. Confucius always urges you to think for yourself, so what do you think? Should we not behave as noble ones and care more for our fellow people? Should we not teach others to fish so that they do not go hungry, and focus more on the old virtues that urge us to observe duties and maintain strong character? Or do you think that Confucianism is too outdated and that the teachings ascribe too little value to individuality? Is that why they do not adapt well to life in Europe or America? Leave your answers and observations in the comments section below.
Sweet. So now people are caught up.
Yeah, I think there's a really nice video to kind of get a short overview concepts that Confucius talked about connect. And yeah, so we've been talking about how we learn, how we ought to behave in our relationships, and how we ought to behave personally. So basically, these are the grounds of Confucian thinking with a bottom-up approach. Basically, the individual makes the state. And what we'll be talking about today will be the top-down approach, basically talking about rulership, talking about tradition and ritual, and how those structures and institutions shape the individual as well. So it was a nice cutoff point last time to go into these two approaches, basically.
The first bias that jumps out, since you're looking to take a top down this time, is authority, and how oftentimes we will assume someone is more correct or more learned based on their station before they even have anything to say. So there's also a greater burden, I think, and streamers share this too, even if it's not an official degree or a spot in government. just by virtue of having an audience, they'll oftentimes assume that what you say has extra value or is going to be more correct.
Well, this is a common problem with philosophy in itself. Basically, it's a cult of personality. We deem some people to be more worth listening to than others, and those are the names we still remember as philosophers, while others just wrote some things and we forgot about it. So I think that basically whether or not you should listen to someone should come from the fact that they're saying good things and not from the title they're having. So if you agree with someone and how they speak and what they talk about, it's probably better than just thinking, oh, they have a degree in this or that, so we ought to believe them. Yeah, so the big question in here is how to ethically improve people. This was what Confucius was all about. It's the core problem of his time was that people were not behaving in an appropriate manner, so he taught to correct them by reflecting on how the state, how society used to be in older times. So he's a conservative and looking back saying, all right, everything used to be better, so we ought to get back to those times. And when it comes on how to improve people, I think it'd be interesting to shortly talk about Skinner and basically what we know from behavioralism on how we can make people behave in a certain way, and 4 different approaches on how to do that. Would you like to say something about that, or should I explain the core concept there?
If you have it in front of you, you can explain it. I have some info on Skinner, but I could probably build off that.
All right. Yeah, so basically, Skinner tested animals in what was called a Skinner box, and he tried to figure out what kind of reward system or punishment system would best to get the animal to do what you want them to do. So there's 4 different modes. There's positive and negative reward, and there's positive and negative punishment.
To clarify what that means for people, positive means you're adding stimulus and negative means you're taking something away. Sometimes people are going to assume that positive means reward and negative means punishment, but it means whether you're adding or subtracting something in their environment.
Yeah, I was about to go into detail by explaining it on the example of my dogs, because I think it's still a bit confusing this way. Mm-hmm. So basically, reward is giving something good, and positive reward is basically that's giving my dog a treat if he does something well. And punishment would be hitting him if he does something wrong. And negative punishment is... Oh, I'm getting confused now. So those are the 2 positive sides where you actively do something. And the negative side is always taking something good away on the punishment part, or taking something negative away on the...
So a couple examples would be taking away their toy if they're misbehaving.
Yeah.
So you're removing that, or you're taking away a punishment. Say you put them outside because they are being bad, and then you're removing that punishment by letting them back inside.
Exactly. So those are basically the different modes we have to make people what you want them to do. And we don't have to go deeper into Skinner box and why that was somewhat controversial, or why it's not always black and white when it comes to these 4 types of conditioning, but it's good to have a concept of how we can do things. And Confucius advocated mostly for a positive reward system or a negative reward system on a personal basis. So basically, he believed that we ought to feel good when we're doing something good, or we ought to feel less bad when we're doing something good. So everything comes from a personal basis, basically. He was also advocating for strict rules, where the rules are clearly set up so people would know how to behave and also when to feel good or when to feel less bad about themselves. And we'll be talking about that when we're looking at tradition and ritual. And lastly, before we start getting into the thick of Confucian thinking, I'd like to talk about, and this was also something that we kind of addressed in the beginning, whether I speak my own views or a philosopher's view, is why I think Confucius is important to me, because I'm not a person that values or used to value ethics or morality really strong. I didn't advocate for family as much as Confucius would have. But basically, philosophy, in my opinion, should not be an echo chamber. So you should read those philosophers you disagree with rather so than the ones you agree with, because it's a good tool to understand different thinking and to get a broader range on your own thinking without necessarily having to agree to someone you read.
This plays into what's called confirmation bias, where we tend to favor seeking information that confirms our position because that makes us feel good that we're correct and we're on the right track, and it affirms us, as opposed to reading things that go against our positions or are coming at it from a different angle. It requires more of an active mind and a critical mind, that those points can oftentimes cast a reflection on your existing views, and you can also kind of critique and see what you disagree with in some opposing perspective. So for both of our background, we're in more of the Western world, so a lot of those philosophers had a greater impression on our culture. So having a foundation of the Eastern thinkers as well, I think rounds it off and also kind of highlights why there are big differences in cultures and societies.
Yeah. So there's an interesting question by Cobra, whether or not there was an aspect of public shaming in Confucianism. And I'd say that not in Confucius teachings and not necessarily in Confucius thoughts, but there's definitely an aspect of public shaming in the current day implementation of Confucianism in Eastern societies. Yeah, so before we get into the thick of it, I want to say it again that I'll be reading from the Edward Slingerland. That is a really nice translation of the Analects. Basically, it provides a lot of traditional commentary, and it gives you a good idea of what he was talking about when he was talking about some of the concepts that we don't necessarily still have these days.
And I pasted the link for that.
Perfect. So, on tradition. Basically, Confucius believed that we ought to know how to do all those rituals that are a core part of Confucianism. It has a lot to do with valuing ancestors. Also, there's Confucius weddings. And basically, the idea of why ritual propriety is important has to do with be a good person. You can't just follow your innate instincts on what's good or bad. You have to learn what's good or bad. And learning the traditions and learning the rituals was part of that.
One thing that I would kind of guess as being a benefit of this emphasis is it's a means to teach people to build discipline over themselves and their behavior, a sort of strictness for procedure, how you go through one step to the other, and how that's, I don't know if he was aware of this, but that's probably the more valuable aspect of emphasizing that practice, was to give people a means to practice self-control.
So what you got open now is the government part, but we start with ritual 1, the texts you have on screen.
Okay. Tradition and ritual. That's government 2-1. Or tradition and ritual 3-1.
No, I mean the text you have on screen now. So we start with 3-1, which is on the image ritual 1.
Okay, yeah, 2-1. Aha. Okay. The master said, "One who rules through the power of virtue is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars. If you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves." Yeah, so I can definitely see the last part. Working from the wrong starting point will lead to nothing but harm. Yeah, I like the comparison of Skinner here, for sure.
So we jumped into the wrong thing, but that's okay.
Oh, did I put the wrong one up? I see.
So now you read the wrong one and had the right one up for what you read. That's not a problem. Yeah, so the comparison to the pole star is a really nice one. He talks also about how good government should attract people. And this notion of, what was it? Heaven's mandate of a ruler being good. And so it just, by being good, he just needs to stand in place and everything will unfold naturally around him in a wu-wei fashion.
A comparison that I have with Christianity is the natural development of commandments and rules that you distribute to your followers, and how if you really drill in those rules, there is an internal sort of sense of shame and conscience that they have. Like, as they quote sin or break these rules, there's their own kind of innate guilt mechanism where they feel bad, they feel a awareness of what they've done wrong, and also a desire to study the ideology more. So this isn't a theistic perspective, but it does have that mechanism of people realizing they're doing things wrong, which allows them to kind of refocus on some task in the process of improving your virtue and your action.
So would you say in Christianity the focus is more so on people to better themselves in terms of reflection and seeing what they did wrong and learning from that? Or is it just the fear of internal punishment?
It can be both. It depends a lot on the flavor and the delivery of the church itself. Because I had been to a few different ones where some of your pastors are very fire and brimstone, where they're focused on, if you don't do this, then pain and suffering fire and all this terrible stuff. They're using scare tactics, basically. And other churches will focus more on the process of growth and building your character and your spiritual strength as a person over time. So it can vary quite a lot.
I think that there's a lot of benefit to preaching growth more so than just eternal punishment. Because if you get to a certain point where you did something terribly wrong, where you know that you would go to hell, it makes it a lot easier to not act morally ever again. So having the emphasis on just constant growth and trying to better yourself is definitely the better approach.
Yeah, it creates an actionable plan rather than just a fear of failure.
Exactly.
I did get up the correct tradition and ritual text this time.
All right.
It was in the wrong order whenever I extracted it in the zip, so I just threw in the top text file. But yeah, this is tradition and ritual.
Yeah. I didn't numberize them, so
Yeah.
still room to improve.
No problem.
So the master said they have 8 rows of dancers performing in their courtyard. If they can condone this, what are they not capable of? And I found this really nice video that talks about tradition and how it relates to being a good person. Do you see it? The Tradition with Ren video.
Yes, I do.
And it also addresses why so uncalled for the ruler of Lu at the time to have 8 rows of dancers, which is quite funny for a Western audience that having too many dancers could be a bad thing.
Yeah, we mentioned that one last time. Ritual with attitude.
I told you that in this Korean text, the glosses on the classics, there is a phrase about 8 dancers. This actually comes from a passage in the Analects where Confucius is talking about one of the noble families of his own state, the Ji family. And he says, the Ji family uses 8 rows of dancers in the courtyard. If this can be tolerated, what cannot be tolerated? Well, you would know, I guess if you lived at those times, that 8 rows of dancers in the courtyard was a prerogative reserved for the Lord, not for any old noble family. And he was using ritual, the ritual of a performance, to usurp the authority of somebody higher than him, or the Ji family was doing this. It was their way of encroaching on the authority of their superiors, which means that ritual can be used hypocritically. You can use ritual to seek advantage. You can use ritual, in fact, to go against the very purposes of ritual itself. And Confucius was aware of this problem, that ritual had become meaningless for many. And if you can't figure out how to make it meaningful again, if you can't figure out how to get a ruler to act as a ruler should act, a subject to act as a subject should act, if you can't do that, then there's no hope for getting back on the right way. And this is the moment at which I think we see Confucius, the philosopher, Confucius, the first great thinker, moral thinker in Chinese history, emerge. Because he accepts that fact. And rather than going in the direction that some of his contemporaries did, which is to say, well, why don't we take rituals and define them as laws and demand that everybody follow these laws or they will be punished. And that way we could have a good society. Confucius says, no, that's not the solution. And what he comes up with is the notion that we have to bring an attitude towards ritual. He begins to focus on an attitude. He has a name for it. He calls it Ren. And he says to his disciples, you know, if you want to be Ren, you can be Ren just like that. You can't do ritual without Ren. You can't make music work without Ren. You have to have this attitude of Ren. But his disciples get very confused. They keep trying to pin him down, to try to get him to define Ren as a particular idea or set of words you could say, or a particular set of actions, ways to behave. And Confucius keeps pulling back. He says, no, Ren is something different. Ren is something different. And what is it? There's a passage in the Analects, and you can see it here. It's called the Method of Ren, the method of what we might call benevolence, humaneness. Actually, any English translation isn't going to be fully adequate, but humaneness, benevolence, these work well enough. Confucius asked, how about somebody who could come in and, and save the world, and make sure that all the starving were fed and bring peace to the world? How about that? He said, wow, as Confucius says, that would be even hard for Yao and Shun, the great sage kings of antiquity. It'd be hard for them. But that's not Ren. That's not Ren. So what's Ren? He said, well, the method of Ren is to want others to advance to the degree that you advance yourself. In other words, it's not about self-sacrifice. It's about the ability to look at the other and see in the other your own interests as well, and want to advance their interests as you advance your own, to see yourself as part of a community where you're helping yourself move forward involves helping others move forward as well. So what Confucius seems to be saying is that to be a person of Ren is to bring to bear on your performance of your duties, of your activities, of your rituals, an attitude of concern for the others. A very simple thing. But if you think about it, that was in some sense the essence of ritual in the first place. That we are acting in harmony together, in response to each other. And Confucius is saying that's the attitude that consciously you must have in you and bring to your performance of life itself.
So the first thing that jumped out at me from this was the aspect of human nature of having a very strong desire to understand why. Why do I need to do this? Why do I need to not do that? Children have this from a very young age, and I think that's one aspect that my parents remember being annoyed about was they'll say, do this, don't do this, and the first thing the kid asks is why. Why is this the case? Why is that not the case? So this is basically a counter to the argument that we should have laws to punish people who don't follow the rituals, because it doesn't build up the why. If you really articulate why the ritual is important, what the purpose is, and what it symbolizes, and why we need to maintain this, then there's an internal desire that's cultivated in each person and in the community to maintain this ritual, as opposed to, you're doing this because we tell you to do this. We're doing this because we understand why we should.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. So going back to the example of having 8 dancers performing. So this was clearly a breach of ritual. Having 8 rows of dancers would have been something that only the could have afforded to do, or should be allowed to afford to do. And Confucius thought, well, if they're not even able to stick to ritual in this very easy task, how can they, or what are they not capable of doing? Where do they not break with ritual if this is already too much to ask?
Well, that's what is usually described as the slippery slope problem, where if you're going to break this rule, what's to stop you from breaking the next rule, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So 6 rows would be okay. 7. I think 7 would already be too many. So people in ancient times were not eager to speak because they would be ashamed if their actions did not measure up. This is again going back to the very humane concept of everyone being personally responsible for how they act or how they speak.
The aspect of Ren that he was talking about seems like a very foundational aspect to having a more collectivist culture as opposed to an individualist one, where there's a very heavy emphasis on wishing your neighbor well and wanting harmony and success for them, as opposed to more of the introspective personal quest that is prioritized higher than the collective.
Well, interestingly enough, this shines through in almost all systems of virtue ethics that we know of, be it Christianity, Buddhism, Islam as well. But basically, this big emphasis on helping others and working as a collective is the core of all these theories, because most thinkers realize that we're better off working together than if everyone just fights for themselves.
See, there's another video for ritual.
Yeah, there's just for people that would like to have a look at what it looks like if you have a couple of rows of dancers. I'm not sure how many rows they have, but they're definitely pushing it. But it's basically a Confucian ritual nowadays and how that would look like.
Korean text.
Just to have an idea on how strict and pretty much strange it is to a Western eye to look at traditional Confucian dances and ritual.
Oh, those are the same link in the document. Whoops.
Wait. I've still got it somewhere.
To bring this into a modern example, the
yeah.
ritual of marriage has been at the forefront of discussion worldwide. Should, you could say, LGBT people be able to marry? Yeah, that's part of what we've said with Confucius a few times, is he had a very conservative ideology and perspective where what happened in the old days was better and we should be striving for that, as opposed to a progressive approach, which is we should be changing and adapting traditions to fit the modern world better. Okay, so this is ancient ritual ceremony.
We don't have to watch the whole thing, just to get a bit of an idea how that looks. Book of Rites, there's a lot of emphasis on what direction people are facing when doing certain tasks. So you see they all are very strict going into one direction, be it north, east, west or south, and this was all already written before Confucius' time, and in the Book of Rites he gathered all those ideas and all those different rituals. And they're still done to this day based on the Confucian collections of rituals, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, the slow pace of it is very reminiscent of that kind of emphasis on discipline and control. It's not a fast, whimsical thing, it's very slow and almost like somber or grim.
Yeah.
That's cool. A very modest 4 rows of dancers. That's good.
Yeah, so the next one in tradition and ritual.
I can set that up. We'll see if we can do it accurately this time. Ritual 1, ritual 2. Success. Okay.
So 617. Who is able to leave the room without going through the door? How is it then that no one follows this way? So way, again here capitalized, so it's talking about the Tao, or the way things are supposed to guide themselves naturally and things happening in a wu-wei fashion. So what Confucius is saying here, that there's one way for the water to run down the mountain to the valley, but why is no one following that way? So basically, there's the teachings, but people are not holding themselves to the teachings till we already know what is right. It's one of his many ways to stab people of his time and tell them, well, you're doing it wrong.
And the next one is, it would not be proper to give Yan Hui a lavish funeral. Hui looked upon me as a father, and yet in this case I was unable to treat him as a son.
So this is Yan Hui, the student of Confucius that died at a young age. He was the kind of Yunzi person even Confucius was looking up to. Confucius' disciples wanted to give him a lavish funeral, which was not appropriate for a man of his rank. And Confucius, while he loved Yan Hui very much and was looking up to him in a moral sense, he still deemed it not appropriate to ritual to give him this lavish funeral. So even though Hui looked up to him as a father and he looked down to him as a son, he didn't want him to have that kind of funeral. And when his disciples still gave him this kind of funeral, he was very displeased.
The ritual is more important than how you feel. The stratification and organization of society is more important than maybe someone who had a bunch of talent. That's what he's saying here.
Exactly. Yeah, it goes into the same slippery slope problem we had before. If they cannot stick up to the traditions when it comes to this funeral, how could they stick up to traditions in any other sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this should give you a good overlook over Confucius's view on traditions and how we ought to implement them rigorously because we learned how to do them, and we basically what we learned and how we can implement that tells a big story about our moral nature. If we're not able to learn, we're not able to act right. And if we're not able to learn the rights and enact them appropriately, we're just not that Yunzi.
One aspect of that it kind of speaks to me as something that I could work on is the process of building rituals for yourself, especially as a secular, non-theistic person, where you don't necessarily subscribe to an ideology that lists out the rituals you should perform. You should still be able to understand the purpose of a lot of those rituals and maybe build one for yourself. So an example would be praying before you go to bed was something that was encouraged for me growing up with Christianity. And that's a way to sort of process the stuff that happened throughout the day and also plan what you're looking forward to tomorrow and in the future, and how that benefit of having some introspection and awareness of your experience at the end of the day doesn't change regardless of your ideology or belief system. So being able to find those kind of meditative spaces for yourself and build rituals that work for you is pretty tough, especially since you're not just copy pasting something else that someone else told you is the appropriate ritual.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's difficult to set up rituals for yourself, and the example you used is a very interesting one. I never looked at prayer in that sense, but being able to complete the day in the evening and to feel a sense of accomplishment, even though you didn't necessarily get everything done you wanted done, but just to finish the day on a good note, reflecting on yourself, is really important for sleep quality. So maybe praying in the evening wouldn't be the worst thing to do, or just reflecting for that matter.
Breathing techniques are a nice physical way to achieve a lot of that awareness and control. It almost reminds me of the slow dance, but it's a connection with your body where you're able to connect with some of your lower order processes rather than the higher order ones. A aspect of having difficulty falling asleep is your mental chatter, like that internal dialogue is just running too fast that you can't let yourself fall asleep. But a breathing exercise is a way to connect with more of that physical process. If you slow your breathing rate down, you can basically will yourself into a more calm and stable state that increases your
Yeah.
chances of letting yourself rest.
Yeah, totally. This reminds me, and I'm not quite sure whether it's from the Hagakure or the Book of Five Rings. Basically, it talks about the samurai being able to um, make a decision within 70 breaths, which speaks to the idea of having to be clear and fast in your decisions, but also an emphasis on slowing it down and taking those 7 breaths in order to contemplate the problem and then act appropriately.
I do a similar thing before I lift. It's not exactly 7 all the time, though. That would be an interesting thing to practice. Before I'm going to do one of my core lifts, either bench, squat, or deadlift, I'll take maybe 10 to 30 seconds to like control my breathing, sometimes hyperoxygenate, and just get ready to execute the lift.
Yeah, that's probably similar to the meditation we're doing before kendo practice to slow, but also so to ready yourself and be in the right mindset to do the task that needs to be done, basically hitting your opponent. Oh yeah, this reminds me, I got a lot of flack for calling the swords used in kendo wooden sticks,
I saw that.
which is appropriate. On the other hand, if I call them, what was it? The shinai and the oh, don't remember. Basically, if I called it by the right name, no one would know what I'd be talking about. I would not refer them as a wooden stick when I'm in the dojo, so don't worry about me and my ritual propriety there.
Yeah, you were using the term based on who the audience was at the time,
Yeah,
rather than the official term.
but it was an appropriate correction of me speaking about it.
Cobra X has a good expansion on what I was saying about prayer. In the Christian faith, it's an act of supplication, admitting that you cannot do everything yourself and that you need to ask God for help. It's a way to communicate. Yeah, that's the part that I left out, which was definitely a part of the process of prayer. What I was talking about was from my secular perspective now. If that's no longer an option, there's still a lot of value in that like behavioral slot at the end of your day to have the introspection and also planning and processing, stuff like that. But yeah, it does give you a lot of courage, I think, and this is an aspect that is distinctly absent in Confucian thought, which is conversing and communicating with a deity or different kinds of angels or gods, which is very common in Christianity, Islam, a lot of the main theistic religions. So yeah, they don't really talk at all about afterlife or anything with this either. Is it totally naturalistic? The
Yeah,
gentleman in the first video said that there wasn't really any aspects that tied it to a world origin story either. It was just like the world it's continuing to live and grow, and just do what you can in this station and situation?
Well, there is some, but it's rather complicated to go into, or maybe I just don't understand it enough to be talking about it. But for the notion of Confucius thought, I think he based everything on our worldly existence, and it doesn't really matter where we came from. It matters how we organize ourselves now that we're already down here. An interesting thing about supplication and Christian faith. I was raised as a Christian. I think that lasted until I was about 15 years old. I remember my theology teacher at the time told us about that back in Jesus' days, there were other people walking the earth also thinking they were the messiahs. And my mind went, all right, well, why do we believe this guy then? So that was my break with the Christian faith. Anyways, basically, the power you can get, or the strength and the good feeling you can from talking to God, from verbalizing your own thoughts and having someone listening to you. If you don't believe in a God, you can realize that this is something that you might as well get from yourself. It's not something that is out there externally that you have to collect when you talk with God, but rather it's something that comes internally by having this sense of reflection on your actions. And basically it has to do with what's the word for it, where you treat yourself nicely.
Compassion?
Yeah, self-compassion, exactly. And that this sense of a higher power comes from within yourself, or can come from within yourself, which is was a really nice insight for me. All right. Script.
So now we got core concept, government, meritocracy, and exam system.
All right. Yeah, so basically the way in Confucianism the rituals are set up are all based on traditions, but there's also some new concepts that come in with Confucianism that haven't been there before, and the two of them being meritocracy, which was something that Confucius envisioned but was not put into practice until quite a lot later. And going into the same vein was the exam system. That's the imperial exam in China, which was used from 200 after Christ until the 20th century. So up until the communists took over China. And it was a way to do meritocracy within not to the point of where you elect the rulers, but you basically all the officials in a state were Confucian scholars and had the sort of merit that was needed to be a good leader for the people.
So it's a sort of like the structure of a lot of like theology. What's the term for it? Theocracy, where you have religious leaders who are directly in government. But this isn't a theistic religion, but it's still the experts of the ideology have merit in governance.
Exactly. Yeah, so basically the merit was based on a couple of different things. The core concepts are still the Confucian virtues. So merit comes from being learned in the classics. It comes from being a good person in a Yunzi sense. It comes from having good relationship with your parents, good relationship with friends. And Yeah, so merit comes from a lot of different aspects from Confucianism itself. And whenever you have a conversation on political philosophy and bring up meritocracy as a interesting way of looking out on how we elect people, there's always this big question. Well, who's the one that decides what has merit in a sense of governing? And well, the authority here was Confucius, so that makes that question pretty easy. But since his whole system was very humanistic, very based on personal responsibility, it's it's based on common sense, basically. He who is a good person and is dedicated enough time into learning and acting in an appropriate manner will be the right person to lead. And he talks about it a couple of times that if you act in this way, that uh, um, yeah, we're gonna read that. So gonna shut up for now. Yeah, so we already got through the first three with the pole star and punishment. The third one I didn't address already was working from the wrong starting point will lead to nothing but harm. And there's been quite some discussion about what the wrong starting point means in this concept. And the basic scholarly agreement was that wrong starting point here means having the wrong beliefs, being basically not Confucian would have been the wrong starting point, not believing in the Tao would have been the wrong starting point, acting for your own sake more so than for your people would be the wrong starting point. So there's a lot of different ways you can start or trying to do something good with the wrong ideas behind it, and it will always lead to nothing but harm.
Yeah, I can understand that. There's, like you said, the problem of, well, what is the correct starting point? And with Confucianism, he is obviously the starting point of what the rules are.
Well, he's not the starting point since he collected a lot of traditional views on the subject, but since he is that...
Well, he's the referee then. He's the one who decides if that is...
Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
But yeah, if we were to implement meritocracy in the current day and age, deciding on what has merit and what has not would be a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, currently it's the merit of how well you can have pull and sway in the political system, which is why we have career politicians who are really good at getting votes and pandering to bases and things like that, where I would say it's very far from being virtue-based, at least in the United States. I think that we're kind of at a low point in terms of electing representatives who put virtue first, and we elect them because they're virtuous. It's almost to the contrary. We have people who are elected because they're willing to compromise on their virtues the most, which can net you the greatest short-term advantage to get really far in the system.
Yeah, I tend to agree that the merit of being good in a popularity contest is not necessarily the one that makes you a good ruler. So, you want to go 218?
Yep. If you first learn as much as you can, then guard against that which is dubious, and speak carefully about the rest. You will seldom speak in error. If you first observe as much as you can, then guard against that which is perilous, and carefully put the rest into action. You will seldom have cause for regret. If in your speech you seldom err, and if your behavior you seldom have cause for regret, an official position will follow naturally.
Yeah, so that's basically the one I was about to refer to before, where if you already act in an appropriate manner, that the natural position or the official position will follow naturally, which is a nice romanticized view of Confucius. He was always hoping to get into this really good position with a ruler, and it did happen in the beginning, but then he realized that those were not the rulers he wanted to serve. So he was walking around finding a different. Most of them felt like, well, I don't need someone teaching me everything that I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, the way that it's worded is pretty flowery. It sounds nice, but it can be kind of confusing. The image that I get is the patience of an owl who quietly sits upon its perch and watches and waits for the correct opportunity, as opposed to, say, a chicken or something that's on the ground just constantly making noise. This is a reminder that I try to give to Twitch chat and also to myself, which is we have an instinct that is to fill space with words if we're in a conversation. But if you have a room with a lot of people, oftentimes it behooves you to wait a little bit longer so that the quality of what you put out is much better, and also be ready to gain information from other people who are talking and also to adjust what you're going to say. So rather than just as soon as you think of a word or a sentence, you type it and hit enter, you think about the flow of what's going on, if that's the best way to word it, if it's appropriate, and then you interject your statement there.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the difference between performance and presence we talked about, I think it was on the second one, where you are in the moment and try to listen to the other person and speak when there's something that needs to be said, but also you thought through what you want to say rather than just having these prepared statements that you want to throw out in order to win an argument, basically. Oversee the people with dignity, and the people will be respectful. Oversee them with filiality and kindness, and the people will be dutiful. Oversee them by raising the accomplished and instructing those who are unable, and the people will be industrious.
This is sort of a lead from the front mindset, but it's virtue based rather than in war you would say it's combat based. So leading by example, being that dignified person that other people can see and then be inspired by and follow. And it ties into that principle where if you're in an authority position, people will assume that your behavior is correct, even if it isn't necessarily. So there's even more of a burden on a ruler as well to set a good example, because if they set a bad example, that affirms a lot of that bad behavior in the population in general.
Exactly. The ruler needs to be the most ethically upright person in the whole state, otherwise he's not worthy of being the ruler. So
Cries an American.
It's basically pretty similar to the concept of the philosopher king, where you want this really knowledgeable and good person to be the one that rules a country.
That sounds like a refreshing change of pace. Can we have one of those?
I'm not sure if they still exist or if they ever have.
Okay. So 12.9 is the next? Yeah.
Yeah.
The Duke asked, "The harvest was poor, and I cannot satisfy my needs. What should I do?" Confucius replied, "Why do you not try to tax your people 1 part in 10? Duke, I'm currently taxing them 2 parts in 10, and even so I cannot satisfy my needs. How could reducing the tax help? If the common people's needs are satisfied, how could their lord be lacking? If the common people's needs are not satisfied, how can their lord be content?" That's awesome. That reminds me of the "without the people there is no king" sort of thing, and it's creating a bottom-up awareness of society of if you have the bottom strata very well off, then they're a more solid foundation for the layers on top of that. If the common person is weak, then the whole country is weak.
Yeah. There was a interesting thought experiment they did at the time, and he basically asked, so the people need three things. They need trust in government, they need food, and weaponry. So if you have all these three, and then goes on asking, well, if you had to take away one of them, which one would it be? And the answer was weaponry. All right, so if you take away two of them, which two would it be? And the answer was weaponry and food. Because if you don't have the trust of the people, the state will fall apart. Whether they have food or weapons doesn't even matter. So the need for the trust of the people was even above food, because even with food, if they don't have the trust in government, the state will still fall apart.
Yeah, that does also speak of the management of crisis and how oftentimes in crisis in a given nation or tribe or whatever, you'll have leaders who stand up and kind of call upon the people to also basically affirm their resolve and be willing to pass through something, and that's all based on trust, right? Because if you just have a person shouting, then it's just noise. But if there's a leader who has the trust of the people, they can guide them through whatever that storm is.
Yeah. So 13.16. As the Duke, act so as those near to you are pleased, and those who are far from you are drawn closer.
Be the excellent person you would like to hang out with in the world.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it.
And I think the aspect of being pleasant is a lot more lacking than I would like it to be in online culture. This is, it's almost the opposite, where being unpleasant is more of the status quo. And it's kind of like a hazing process where people have their online internet toughness where you just insult each other to no end. And that's the norm of the online gamer. Whereas having someone who, I talk about this in terms of seeing people's lines in chat. Whenever you see them show up in the chat, whatever they say is always pleasant. And by the time you've read their name, you already know that it's going to be nice. So
Yeah.
having that as an awareness of yourself, of how pleasant am I to be around, it has really big effects on all of your interactions in life.
Yeah, exactly. There is something to be said about the anonymity that the internet provides, and how we ought not necessarily behave the same way we would in normal society, where our face is showing and people can put a name to it. And I'm not sure whether we talked about this when we talked about the ancient Greeks. There's this story, the Ring of Gyges. And so it's basically the ring that makes you invisible, same as Lord of the Rings. Sorry for the spoilers.
What?
Yeah, so the ring makes you invisible, and they have this big conversation. So basically, the guy that finds the ring uses it to sleep with the king's wife and steal a bunch of stuff. I think he kills the king, and just he does all this awful stuff when he was invisible. But the whole argument was not based whether or not his actions were good or bad, but whether or not one should still behave in an appropriate manner if there's no reason or there's no fear of consequences for it. And the common sense that they came up with was, well, if you don't have to fear any repercussions, you might as well do what you please. The immoral thing would be holding yourself back even though there are no consequences. And I think that this applies really well to the age of the internet.
Yeah. Making the connection too, though, of just because you're anonymous doesn't mean that you don't have those effects on people, because you can imagine and I guess this is the point that's lacking with the example in the story versus real life, is this person who's invisible and carrying out all these evil actions can see the pain and the impact that they're inflicting on the world. Whereas with the anonymity of the internet, a lot of those human expressions of someone who is upset or distraught at what you've just said about them, or stressed out, and they're not having good time anymore, you don't necessarily see that, so you don't have that feedback loop of empathy of, I said something really terrible, I see disgust and sadness in someone else's face, so I realize that was wrong, and then I feel bad. You just type words, and then it's just based purely on what they say back in text.
Yeah.
I don't think our empathy is activated through text as well as it is through facial expression and tone of voice.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Yeah, and I'm not advocating for more anonymity on the internet. I think people would behave more appropriately if you had their name tags to it and you could look up the person. On the other hand, I see a lot of people that do the same kind of hateful commentary with their, what I assume to be an official Facebook profile, where people could look it up, and really weird, where you don't think about the implications of writing something hateful or stupid out and having the rest of the world seeing it for the rest of the time the internet exists, which could be a long time.
I've talked with Agent Smith a lot about the strongman leader archetype and how you have some different world leaders who talk a big game and they'll do a lot of posturing and oftentimes bully the competition a whole bunch, and how there's an aspect of the human psyche that is amused and inspired by this. They see it as a form of boldness or bravery that they laugh at and like to follow, as opposed to that bullying is a negative rather than a positive. It's not a strength. It's usually a tactic that's actively harming other people to have some short-term gain for yourself. So with the internet sort of culture, that is probably an aspect of it as well, where some people gain a following because they seem tough when they act hard like that to other people, rather than say, well, you don't know the broader impact and especially the long-term impact on society. Any given person who's being bullied may have a lot of other stuff on their plate as well, and you don't have the context of that. So it's better to be careful about your words and your expression and to uplift those around you rather than destroy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the strongman leader is a relic from pre-agricultural times, where we lived in tribes and we wanted to have a leader that was this strong, tough guy that would lead us into battle or lead us into hunting down a mammoth. And there's been somewhat of a breach in that social tract, and where we expect the leader to be the strong man to bring us through the hard times, even though they have to make tough decisions. They're the ones doing it. So the breaching social contract being that we're also expecting them to take responsibility for when things are going wrong, or being the first one to be stabbed by the enemy tribe if things go south, basically. So we expect them to be leading, not just to the point where they tell us what to do, but to be the example in leadership as to following through with their teachings.
Right. So the way that I see this in a sort of battle formation is the strong leader should be leading from the front, whereas in modern government, the president or prime minister or whatever is leading from the back. But they're still talking the game as though they're going to take responsibility and they're going to have consequences for those actions. There's the whole buffer of all of society that oftentimes suffers the consequences before they do. They're not putting themselves physically at risk, which I think changes the dynamic of war as well and military activity. presidents aren't out on the front line. There are some rare examples and relics of this. Like there's some British royalty who will do some military service, and that's a way of trying to connect with the people who are actively involved in those risky and dangerous situations. But yeah, there is a big contradiction there when you have the strongman leader who's leading from the back.
Yeah, and I'm also not sure whether or not the English royalties that go into the military are really put into harm's way. The regular soldiers would have been. Not something I. So
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be putting them into the most dangerous situations. Prince Harry was a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan. I think that was the station that he fulfilled, which is reasonably dangerous. I mean, you could not go to Afghanistan, or you could just stay in a base the whole time. So he's doing stuff, obviously not being put in the fray with a gun and stuff. But yeah, I think it's a nice gesture that speaks to that awareness of if the country is going to go into a conflict, the rulers should also indicate that they think this is worth them taking a risk as well, not just using the population as a tool to fulfill those aims.
Yeah, exactly. Interestingly, all the Greek philosophers that we talked about, they were all war heroes. So they all fought in wars and were generals or just good fighters normally.
Oh,
they had
Sorry, Harry was a gunner, not a pilot. But yeah, same thing.
All right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. They were
heroes
and generals and...
Yeah, so basically this notion that you ought to serve not only by talking about it, but also by putting it into action was still very alive in ancient Greece.
This fits with the trend that we had talked about before with the amount of violence in everyday life of the common person around the world, and how century by century the world has gotten less violent. So going back further in time, you're increasing the chances that people are going to need to be a part of a physical conflict of some kind, rather than having more specialized military. It used to be, if a population is under attack, anyone who has the strength to wield a weapon is going to be called into action. As opposed to now you have career military where that is your job and that's what you're specialized and trained to do. And it's a much smaller percentage of the population that's actively fighting.
Well, not so in Switzerland. But that's a story for another day. So as far as we know, Confucius was a pacifist. So he did not participate in any wars actively. There's a interesting story about Mencius, one of his disciples, that basically was the founder of Neo-Confucianism, so a bit of an abstract of Confucian thought, or putting it a bit more into practice than Confucian did, which is a weird thing to say, I guess. But basically, he supported a military coup and was really displeased with himself that he did so. So he basically got tricked into helping a ruler that pushed out another ruler, and he was very displeased that he didn't look through the ambition of that ruler and that he supported him at the time.
I've been duped.
Yeah, so the last one. And this was the question about executions. So in your governing, what need is there for executions? If you desire goodness, then the common people will be good. The virtue of a gentleman is like the wind, and the virtue of a petty person is like the grass. When the wind moves over the grass is sure to bend.
Yeah, that's a interesting difference between cutting the grass, I guess, would be the analogy for following through with executions as a form of punishment. where this
Yeah.
is saying the wind is going to be reducing the height of the grass in the same way and kind of shaping it how you want it to be shaped. And
Exactly.
that also fits with the consistency of a situation. So in the statement, the virtue of a gentleman is like the wind. If the virtue is consistent, it would be like the wind being consistent, so the grass would be consistently lower, which is what you're trying to achieve there.
Yeah.
And by Confucian teaching, your virtue should be consistent.
Well, it only makes sense if you're always putting into action what you're saying, and the things you're saying are the right things to say. The wind should constantly blow.
Did you see my video I exported recently about me getting focused on metrics and growth too much?
I saw the video, but I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah, so the TLDR of that, I ended up basically losing sight of the purpose for me building the stream and the awareness of the value of the individuals I've met through that journey. And I was at a low point for my personal morale because my numbers in the dashboard were a lot lower than they were during the war chest promotion. So we had all these different promotions that stacked up, and I started to change my identity as a streamer who had 800 to 1,000 average concurrent, which the growth was really exciting. And seeing the numbers go down, it made me feel sad and kind of, not in a major way, but moderately depressed and less excited to stream and that kind of thing. And then reminding myself of the origin of why I chose to stream and what virtues and practices I'm trying to teach to people on Twitch, and how nothing of that mission is related to metrics and numbers in the dashboard at all. And the distance that's been covered from the starting point to now is utterly massive. And at that point I was kind of moved and very I guess frustrated with myself in a way that I was so easily led along by that success in the short term that caused me to betray a lot of those virtues and principles that I talk about a whole bunch. Whoops. I'm in much better sorts now just by framing it correctly again.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example you're setting there, that you, through reflection, realized you got upset by something that is not worth getting upset about. And yeah, I think that it's most important for you to be enjoying what you do, and probably best not to look at the metrics at all, which isn't to say that you need to be sustainable with what you do, and the metrics can put that into perspective somewhat. But as Confucius said, you ought to be like the North Star, and people will come to you and listen to you because you do what you do, and you love what you do, more so than adjusting to the audience.
Yeah, Ren comes to mind with this, where the metric is a physical number that's a digit that you can look at, but it's people. Like, it's an actual human, breathing, thinking person with beliefs and desires and a perspective and a personality and all this. And wanting them to have the most rich and fulfilling and entertaining experience they physically can is the most important thing. And even if you have just one other person in the audience, that's still the goal, and that's still a person, which is an incredibly valuable interaction. And one of the best things about streaming on Twitch is having that interplay between people who can share their thoughts.
Yeah, it's a really nice way of connecting to people. On the other hand, I think your metrics going down has a lot to do with the promotional stuff that you were doing. You were on front page a lot of time. And the content you provide, while it leaves most of us that kind of got to know the stream coming back, I don't feel that most people that are watching Twitch are out for this virtue community. I don't think the sages on Twitch are the ones that get the most viewers, unfortunately.
Well, the struggle that we have in general on Twitch and on YouTube is people want their content to be loud and fast and ridiculous, where it's very hype, it's very clickbaity, and stuff is happening in a rapid succession. And a lot of good ideas and good examples and things like that take a lot longer to unfold. And conversations with other people also take a really long time to achieve and flesh out and things like that. So yeah, I didn't set out to be one of the most successful people who is using all the algorithms and things like that. There are a lot of YouTube channels now that are pretty disgusting to see, just in how they're almost counter to any form of virtue or respect and that kind of stuff, and they gain popularity because they're so ridiculous. Reality TV, I think, and tabloid journalism also plays into these human hungers for gossip and drama and things like that. But those buttons are easier to push than building something that is fulfilling over the long term and also challenging. Being challenged as a person to do something better when you've done something wrong or you've harmed someone or overstepped in your language is something that feels bad generally. So say you get admonished or scolded for a given behavior, to reflect on that, to process it, and then to change is not the most fun thing, but it's very rewarding. I think most people, with the confirmation bias discussion we were having before, they would prefer to just have their behaviors affirmed of, yep, look, this famous YouTuber with all these viewers is doing the same thing that you did that you felt bad about. Wow, that's funny. I guess it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. What comes to mind for me there is, do you know the big 5 of personality traits?
No, what are they?
So basically it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Conscientiousness?
Yeah. So these are basically the 5 big traits that define our personality. And we have all of them to different degrees. And one thing that they talked about was openness as a trait, basically being open to having, to experiencing new things, to having your views challenged. Basically being open to stuff you didn't know before is a big trait that defines how we vote. And I'm not going to go into which side votes which way. You can do that on your own. It has a lot to do whether or not we're engaged in conversation that are not as easy. It has a lot to do with how we're looking at the world, basically. If we have this determined mindset or if we're just open to things might be different. And practicing openness is a really good thing to do. To just try something new, whether or not you think you'd like it beforehand or not, doesn't really matter. You should experience it and then decide upon the experience.
One aspect of this and an exercise that I try to practice in conversation with people, especially people who disagree with me, is to think about 2 cases. Case 1 is my perspective and how I see things to be. And I also have case 2 running in my mind of understanding their perspective and how their logic is built up. So when they're articulating their position, I'm trying to follow their line of reasoning through all of it, even if it's not perfect reasoning, but to know where they're coming from and imagining the case where they're correct, this is how that line of logic follows. That allows you to be on the same page as them in the conversation, even if you don't necessarily agree or change your position. Sometimes it can surprise you that maybe they arrived at something that's fairly useful or fairly interesting or good, or maybe even in some cases better than your line of reasoning and your perspective. And that creates a lot of opportunity to share perspectives, share information, and mutually improve. Because so many people, they're just taking it all as a debate of, I want to be right and I want you to be wrong and I want to win, as opposed to, I want to understand your perspective in a very thorough and detailed way so that I know it kind of like the back of my own hand. And when we're talking, I'm right there with you, understanding stuff, even if I'm not right there with you in agreement all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's basically if you're open to having your views challenged, and it's not whether or not the other person is doing that. It's more so that you yourself have to do that, where you need to be having a critical point of view towards your own thinking, which is not too common. I think confirmation bias is far more prevalent than people that tend to question themselves. And I see interesting potential there in terms of meritocracy and how we elect our leaders these days. So basically, we wanted to have this tough man leader in the time where we needed to fight the other clan living 2 hills from ours, and we fight over the hunting grounds and whatnot, where you didn't want to have people that did too much thinking and hesitated with their actions. You wanted someone that was fast with the stabbing, basically. While nowadays we still look up to that kind of leadership, but for a leader nowadays, it would be, in my opinion, more important to have someone that is able to reflect on their own thinking, to have that kind of openness, to see where they're going wrong, and then act accordingly once they realize what went wrong.
Well, the role has changed now for a lot of it. So the example you gave was more of a combat situation, which does require speed of action in every aspect. Whereas elected representatives, as the word suggests, they are elected by the population, and their job is to represent the population, which I think oftentimes is lost. The person who is elected oftentimes immediately tries to push what they want or further their own career, as opposed to the active listening of, who are my people, what do they want, what is the state of the world, and how can I be a servant to the people in this station that I have.
Yeah, I think that people just assumed that they got elected because the people wanted them to profit as much, not for the people themselves to profit. So it has to do with empathy, in my opinion, where you're able to empathize with the people that elected you and see that they did that for their own betterment, not just for yours. Yeah, so did we already... Yeah, we read the last one. So those are all the kind of examples I have from the Analects that kind of illustrates his views on government and how we ought to elect the right people, and how those, or how we ought to... election wasn't a thing back in his days, but how we look up to the good ruler and look up to a bad ruler, but also how the rulers ought to behave. And from this we can... there's 2 things. I wanted to look up a video that kind of describes the imperial exam system, which I wasn't able to find. So there's this presentation, but it would take at least another half an hour to go through it, so I might as well just tell a little bit about the exam system and how that was set up to find the best officials to be working for that, unless you want to go through the whole thing.
You can sum it up, I think.
All right. So there's the imperial exam system was introduced in 200 It's based on the Great Learning, which is part of
You cut out for about
the.
10 seconds, sorry. You said the exam system was started in 200 and it cut off.
All right. The exam system was founded in 200 BCE, and it was based on Confucian teachings. It's basically part of the Great Book of Learning that we talked about in the first time a little bit. And it's a system that is based foremost on having read the Confucian the Confucian classics and the four classics themselves. And it's a system that was implemented to be open to everyone, which isn't to say that it was open to everyone. You needed some good tutors and a lot of time to be able to prepare for the exam system to be able to have a chance. A poor person would rise up through the rank because they did not have the time and the resources to prepare for it. But technically, it was a system that was set up so everyone could rise within the imperial exam system to get into a elected or a assigned spot in government. Those were the Confucian scholars that basically run the state, while there were some kings that came from the dynasties that had the most say, but they were not the ones implementing policy and getting all the stuff done. That was the Confucianists, roughly for 2,000 years now. And there was this idea that basically every town that has more than 25 families should have a school for preschool, then I'm not sure with the numbers, let's say 50 that should have a bigger school, and so on. So that basically everyone should have the chance to get an education if they choose to do so. Education was not mandatory at the time. It was something you ought to do in a way that people wanted to get educated, not that they felt compelled to go to a school, which is something we could learn from nowadays as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the gaps in teaching with public education. I can't really speak of other countries, but in the United States, a lot of it is results-oriented schooling, where you need to show up, it's required, and you need to get these grades to pass to advance to the next grade, as opposed to having some process of trying to instill in the children the value of learning and to build that hunger and desire to learn new things and how it benefits you in the rest of your life in pretty much every conceivable way. It feels like you're just being told to do stuff and it's lacking the why. Why are we going to school? Why is this important?
Yeah. Yeah, and I felt like that through most of my school time. It's kind of like, well, this is interesting, but how should I ever use that in my common everyday life?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the exam system, there's 3 different exams basically going up in rank. So if you pass the first one, you can do the second one and the third one. And the more of these exams you pass, the higher the position you were able to get. So the most common exam was held on a regional basis, and then it was on a state basis, and for the exam you had to go to the the capital to do the third exam. So it was building up basically. And yeah, the question that were asked were almost all based on the 4 classics and Confucius teachings, and that held up until the 1900s. So you really had to know all these classics by heart and to be able to do good in that kind of exam, and that why everyone that got through the exam system was by definition a Confucianist. So if they at some point would have changed the questions in the exams to represent other views, they would have had different people as head of their institutions. But the way it was set up was just to have the right and proper Confucian that were good to go through the system. And it used to be that the exam system, people that went through the exam, they were really honored by society. They had a really big emphasis on people having knowledge, being good people, being worthy people, being people to look up to. Something that we're kind of missing in Western society to some degree as well. So when you were able to go to the exam in the capital, you had to bring your own chalk to write with and water, but everything else was provided by society basically. So you had free food, you could sleep at a bunch of places just because everyone was looking up that you're the kind of person that was able to take the imperial exam.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we're going to look a little bit at how the impact Confucian thought had on Chinese society. And then we'll be almost done for this lecture. So basically after Confucian, and I don't remember the name of the dynasty, but they were really at odds with Confucian thought, so they burned a bunch of books and allegedly buried scholars alive, which is a pretty rough thing to do.
It's a big yikes.
I had a quote for that one. So, if your servant proposed that all historian records are then those of queens be burned. So queens would be the preceding. Would be the dynasty. Basically, they said their teachings are the ones that should stand. Everything else should be burned. With the expectation of the academics whose duty includes possessing books, if anyone under heaven has a copy of the classic of poetry, the classic of history, or any other writing of the 100 schools of thought, they shall deliver them to the governor or to the commandment for burning. Anyone who dares to discuss these books shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have their family executed. Any official who sees the violation but fails to report them is equally guilty. Anyone who has failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be subject to tattooing and sent to build the Great Wall. The books that have been exempt are those on medicine, divination, agriculture, and so forth. So basically, they wanted to have all the teachings that were not in line with their doctrine burned, and all the scholars that studied them buried alive. For roughly 300 years before the, I want to say Shin dynasty, but I'm terrible with the names, so never mind. Until the preceding dynasty, and they are what really put into practice Confucius thought. They had this return to all those traditions, to the rituals of the Confucian days. They were the ones implementing meritocracy with the imperial exam system, and the way they set it up was how China used to do it for the 1,700 years after that. So that's a pretty sick move on their part.
So you know what happened? The dynasty cut the grass and the grass grew back. Should have just been a strong wind instead. A lot less violent.
Exactly. Interesting thing they talked about on the history lesson we watched last time is at some point you had the Mongols that took over, and they were pretty different in their thought and in their beliefs, and they had a pretty firm grip on Chinese society, but they were good at conquering stuff, not so much at ruling. So when they ran into problems with irrigation, for example, what was a big topic. Who did they have to turn to when they had question about how to solve these problems? It always was the Confucius scholars that were already in place, that they might have lost their job, but they still had the knowledge. So you turned to the Confucian scholars and they guided you towards whatever you wanted to do. So it took them roughly 50 years until the Mongols that were stationed in China were Confucianists as well. So basically culture rolled on no matter the outside influences, because it was such a firm and well thought through culture, basically.
This happens a lot for conquerors in general, where they conquer a territory and settle there, and then they end up integrating with the people, and especially if the population they have conquered has more kind of knowledge and study about it. That's usually going to take precedence over ignorance, just because it has a lot of utility, such as irrigation, as you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. Basically the same thing with the Romans speaking Greek after invading Greece.
Vikings picking up Christianity and so on.
Yeah. Also, the Muslims having to pray 7 times a day or 5 times a day.
I think it's 5.
I'm not sure which one it is. Basically, it used to be 3 times a day until they went into Zoroastrian territory where they had 5 times a day, and they said, well, we don't really mind praying to this other god as long as basically it means that you don't kill us if we change religion, but can we stick to our traditions in having to pray 5 times a day rather than 3? And so they integrated that into Islam these days, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, Zoroastrianism is another thing we ought to talk about at some point. It's basically the proto-religion, this distinction between good fighting the bad, and how the influence it had on all of Western religion is pretty impressive.
Where was it, you said? Like what region?
I think it was Iran, but I'm not 100% sure. I always struggle on how to write it as well. Zoroastrianism. And Nietzsche talks in his book about Zarathustra, and Zarathustra was the original priest of Zoroastrianism, or the prophet, basically. So basically Nietzsche said that, well, Zarathustra was the one that fucked it up in the first place. Yeah, ancient Iran. Did I say Iran? I'm
yes,
not sure.
You did. You were correct.
Yeah, so where were we? Yeah. So this system was set up and it persisted over a long time, very successfully, up until the Cultural Revolution in the early 20th century, where the communists took over China. And I think you can ask Agent Smith next time about how that happened. He's a lot better in talking about that than me. But basically, what happened then in terms of Confucian values was the communists were really opposed to Confucian values because an emphasis on family as the foundation for everything, was very much against communist lines, where it's the state that is the most important thing there is. So they sorry.
I was just gonna like clue people in from the previous session. We had a graphic before where it showed the lines of relationships between, and you said the most important was father son, and then there's ruler subject, husband wife, and friend to friend, and how the party becomes the ruler, and the most important relationship it is the person to the party. And basically with communism it was the only one that was important, right?
Yeah. They went into at the time of Confucius, there was also the Maoist movement, which agreed in a lot of ways with Confucian thought, but always argued that you shouldn't value family over everyone else. That you should, and you should have universal law for everyone, which they had some pretty interesting arguments about, where they basically were called out on acting in that sense that they value someone over someone else, and that this whole doctrine of having universal law for everyone is just not something that's could be done, basically. But the Communist Party was strong in that Maoist value that we should love everyone equally, but the state being the most equal and the equalizer should be loved most. So they had this break with Confucian thought, and they turned down Confucian statues. That they really talked bad about him, this slaveholder, and was just there to uphold the status quo, and how he was going against his own teachings, basically, which is not wrong per se, but it's also not correct in a sense that he was very much living up to his teachings, but those teachings were just not in line with what the communists thought was best for China.
Well, the Communist Revolution was very fast-moving and sudden and very modern as well, and Confucius, being a conservative, oftentimes was really focused on maintaining the status quo, which is everything against having a revolution. A revolution is about overthrowing the status quo and having something very different and very new. So I could see why they would be very opposed to his teachings and his views, just because that would be friction against them.
Exactly. Interesting. Revolution, as it is called in China, literally translates to stripping the mandate. So it was about taking away the mandate of heaven from those who ruled China before, for the people to have a say, basically. So heaven's mandate is still a thing, even up to this day in Chinese culture. So there's two more things. One is a short little, I want to say BBC, but it's probably something else. Documentary today. About China today. Yeah.
A return to Confucian values.
And the other one would be Xi Jinping in his latest address. No, it wasn't his latest. I think it was end of 2017. And it's just the end of his speech, but basically he's very much reflecting Confucian values in his speak, and it kind of shows the shift towards how Chinese, the political party, has also this return to Confucian thought as well.
Messed up my pasting of the link. Whoops. Okay. So now I have both of the links. We'll start with the Chinese party turns to Confucius.
This is a traditional style wedding held inside the Confucius Academy in China's southwestern city of Guiyang. Following the rituals of the Han Dynasty, which ended 1800 years ago, the couple tie together strands of their hair, wash each other's hands, and take a sip of bitter wine. Finally, they kneel and bow their heads to a statue of Confucius.
我们每一个仪式的环节，我们都会向友人，还有来这里的亲朋好友，以及在这里的市民，我们都会告诉他每一个环节是做什么的。这一个礼它的寓意是什么？它也有一个就是传播的作用吧。希望大家都知道我们的传统婚礼，知道我们的传统文化。
This and other activities at the government-supported Confucius Academy are among the clearest illustrations of how China is trying to revive traditional culture, especially Confucianism, as a source of political legitimacy. Confucius emphasized respect for elders, social ritual, and personal moral virtue. His ideas dominated China for 2 millennia, but were attacked as backward and feudal when the Communist Party took power. Now the party is returning to many Confucian ideas, while clamping down on Western influence in academia, art, religion, and civil society. The academy was built by local developers at a cost of $185 million and opened in 2013. A 30-foot tall Confucius statue towers over visitors as they climb a long staircase leading to the entrance of the 75-acre complex. Now managed and funded by the local government, the academy also provides coming-of-age rituals for children, facilities for Confucian scholars to live and work, and free lectures on Confucian philosophy to the public.
里边呢，我们正在进行的就是叫公益性的文化讲座。中国是一个礼仪之邦，是特别强调道德治理、道德治人这么一个国家。那么这些年来，越来越重视对传统文化的弘扬。那么建立孔学堂就是这样一个目的。
Few Chinese people still believe in communism, and as the economy slows, the party can no longer rely on the promise of rapid wealth creation to keep it in power. China's leaders hope places like this will provide a new sense of cultural identity and a reason to reject Western political ideals, while encouraging Chinese officials to be less corrupt.
改革开放30多年了，那么我们的经济社会取得了很大的发展，但是在精神方面，我就说在道德方面，这么多年以来，各种各样的原因是有问题的，我们是有不少的问题。
Last year, local authorities opened a traditional culture training center for local officials, the first of its kind in China. Provincial and city bureaucrats have been attending regular training courses here ever since.
如果中国人站在世界上，除了他经济上好、科技上发达以外，精神上、道德上也要好，我们要成为一个真正的文明人。
Yeah, I think the aspect of this is connecting with how rich, old, and refined Confucian tradition is. Because if it's been a part of the country for thousands of years, and then suddenly you're trying to replace all that with something new, whatever is replacing it doesn't have that same lore and history and refinement to it, which I think leaves something to be desired for people and also for their identity and enthusiasm for the party that is currently ruling.
Yeah, I think that basically the cut with Confucianism was important at the time of the rise of the Communist Party, but those values that are very much instilled into Chinese society, they're still there, and having a return to knowing where they come from and to teaching back those guidelines is a nice way, and makes a nice comeback for Confucianism, which, as we know from the Mongols, it takes about 50 years for it to get back to the center of all of political discussions in China.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the communists are just now a different brand of Confucian scholars. which is probably a bit a romanticized way to look at it. I think they have other problems that they have to deal with than they used to have in ancient times. But I think that they are very much getting away from a lot of communist ideology and return to Confucian thought, which is a nice thing to see, in my opinion.
Well, the thing that this person was saying in the video was that the communist ideology lacks the moral and spiritual development that Confucianism has. And spirituality, in this sense, is a humanist one for Confucianism, but for a person, there is still that desire of your purpose and your place in the world and your human spirit, your morals and your uprightness and how you should act and things like that. And it was very well fleshed out with Confucianism, and since that was traditionally a part of the country, it is a part of their identity, so I think it's going to be something that'll be easy to reintegrate given how long it's worked there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a solid system. It has stood up for longer than any other culture that is still alive. So I think that says something about how practical it is.
One domain that is the closest to this that we will talk about at some point probably is India. India is a culture that it's maybe not quite as consistently continuous as Chinese culture, and it was more fragmented for a lot of it, but its culture is a similar age, and a lot of that wisdom and knowledge has passed thousands of years from one generation to another. Less turnover than, say, Europe, for example.
Yeah, a lot less turnover. Interesting thing about India here is that it's basically two cultures that clash in India. It's the Vedic tradition, a lot of influence on Zoroastrianism, which had a lot of influence on all of the Western religions, but also there's Buddhism, and the two of them kind of collide within India. So talking about a Indian culture is inherently difficult. We have to talk about these two subsets of Indian culture, basically.
Yeah, so it's not as uniform as Chinese tradition.
Yeah.
Cool. And then we have the New Year address from Xi Jinping.
Exactly.
Let's go.
I want to say one thing first. I guess there's a lot of people that see Xi Jinping as this kind of dictator in the making, and I don't want to address whether or not I find this is true or not. I think it's possible, and I don't want to romanticize China at its current state. They're having a lot of problems, and I'm not advocating for Xi Jinping being this philosopher sage that would be the best ruler that China could have. I just wanted this to basically illustrate in his last couple of lines in his speech he gave how much the party has come back to using Confucian rhetoric and how they communicate with the people. Whether or not they do this just as a propaganda stunt or it's their true belief, I can tell. It's basically take this with a grain of salt, but it's interesting to see how they implement Confucian thought in modern society.
So you're saying that you're not pushing his dogma on the viewership right now?
I try not to.
Yeah. All right, let's do it.
我们伟大的发展成就由人民创造，应该由人民共享。我了解人民群众最关心的就是教育、就业、收入、社保、医疗、养老、居住、环境等方面的事情。大家有许多收获，也有不少操心事、烦心事。我们的民生工作还有不少不如人意的地方，这就要求我们增强使命感和责任感， 把为人民造福的事情真正办好、办实。各级党委政府和干部要把老百姓的安危冷暖时刻放在心上，以造福人民为最大政绩，想群众之所想，急群众之所急，让人民生活更加幸福美满。谢谢大家。
The line "they must think for the people" is a pretty Monka-esque one for me personally. It kind of treats it. I don't know exactly how he meant it, and this is translated to English, of course, which it always has some problems when you're translating from one language to another, what the literal meaning was versus the intended meaning. But yeah, you can tell the sentiment is there that the party now, at least the way that this speech is presented, is a little bit more apologetic rather than the firebrand of the party is best and we're doing great and we're leading you and taking care of you. I think North Korea is a good example of a country that oftentimes pushes that rhetoric more of the world is collapsing, but we're the last bastion of hope. This is more indicating there are things that we can do better, and we're kind of listing out what we're trying to do. And the spirit of it does seem to be, as you're saying, more Confucian in tone than communist.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they're gonna implement this and whether or not the officials are really serving the people or serving their own interest. But just interesting for me to see how the rhetoric has come back and how they're really emphasizing this humanitarian ideal of a society that should work. And this will probably have an impact more so on the people than it has on the leaders themselves, where they feel more, they have more trust in their leaders than they would otherwise have, which, as we learned before, is the most important part, that you have the trust of the common people.
Mm-hmm. And one small point just related to his delivery is the cadence of a way a person will speak in a leadership role is oftentimes very slow relative to common speech, just to make sure every word is received by every person who's listening, from the most educated to the least educated, and also to people who maybe don't have the most firm grasp on the language, so if they're an immigrant or something like that. So that's an active practice that I've worked on as well as a streamer, and Kukio was a really good example for this, because I did have the expectation as a teenager kind of coming of age that the smarter you were, the faster you should talk to get the ideas out as fast as possible. And I ran into Kukio and saw him talk with other kids who were basically on the level with everybody else, who were pretty bright, and he would speak much slower. Nothing was ever missed, and it was very clear and easy to follow what he was saying. And it also indicated a level of patience with the process of conversation, which I think, in terms of your intention, can go a really long way, and also how pleasant you are to converse with too, where it's not necessarily a race. You're more in it for finding the most correct answer rather than throwing as many darts at the board as you physically can. Just really taking your time for the setup and making sure what you're doing is correct every step of the way.
Do with the perception of it, in my opinion, where if you have someone that talks really slowly, more so than just putting out as much points as possible, the one that opposes his view always has the chance to ask a question or to disagree with something specific, more so than having to wait through the whole spiel until he can respond to it. So if you talk slowly, it translate this kind of trust in that you know what you're saying is correct, and you don't have to fear anyone going over a specific point you're trying to make and picking it apart and showing you that you're wrong.
It's obviously a tangent to Xi Jinping and his message and that kind of thing. It was more about the delivery, but I think it's worth being aware of in conversation in general.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was Confucius Part 2, and I think we hopefully all have a good sense on how to be virtuous and who to elect in the next general election.
I was thinking I wish virtue was more of a word that people discussed more just in society and the world, of trying to refine who they are as a person in that capacity. In the US, it's very success and results driven, I think, and that does have some benefits, like the growth of our economy and being a front runner in that capacity, but it comes at a cost if you cut corners to meet with success. And a lot of times we have this problem in the business world where they'll tend to hire people who know how to create immediate term gains, but long term it doesn't end up working out very well. And virtue, I think, speaks to that, where a lot of virtue is the longer term process for having a better imprint on your community and the rest of the world, oftentimes at the cost of some instant gratification that you could seek for yourself.
Yeah, it's a long process to get people where they act virtuously. I mean, it's been tried for 2,500 years in China now, and obviously we still don't have a ruler that we can trust without needing to compromise. So it's a difficult thing to do, and as we learned in the beginning, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily turn towards being more virtuous just by learning about the virtues. But it's something that's interesting to contemplate, and something that's interesting to try to put into action as well, where you just go out and try to be good to people and see what results from doing that, more so than treating people shittily. It's something that not many Twitch viewers seem to have tried. Not making a statement about your chat. But yeah, it's interesting, and I think since the nature of virtues is the nature of how we basically govern ourselves as a society, how we set up the rules, it should be front and center in public discussion all the time. It's what we deem to be right or wrong should be basically that what we talk about, more so than what celebrity has sex with whom or whatever else the today's flavor of discussion is.
Yeah, one aspect relating to the Twitch viewer in the process is a Twitch viewer, unlike a TV viewer, has opportunity for interaction, and also that creates potential to make mistakes and do the wrong thing. Whereas oftentimes, if you're in situations and your behavior is untested, then you don't necessarily make the mistake, but if you represent that lack of virtue in yourself, then that's still a problem. So the plus side is, with chat interaction, you have the opportunity to be open to change and to learn and to grow from other people. One thing that I talk about a lot here is challenging people to improve at their communication skills and their speechcraft in a way that makes them more effective as speakers and listeners, and also, to quote the statement from today, more pleasant to be around. Be pleasant.
Yeah, so that was Confucius Part 2, and I think next time I'll be talking about Siddhartha Gautama, Buddhism, and the Eightfold Path, which is a bunch more virtue signaling.
Sweet, sounds like a good time. And calendar-wise, this should be neighborhood of the end of this month, so I will be out of town through the 19th.
All right.
So we could do something maybe as early as the 22nd. We have Discord, we can sort things out, but I will announce it ahead of time.
All right. Perfect.
Yeah, awesome having you on. I very much enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for teaching us some stuff.
Thank you for having me. And enjoyed your time off.
Yep, I'm going to try to center myself, keep it real, and think about what I'm going to do moving forward. It's always nice to take a few more steps outside. They have nice big trees up there in Washington State, so the air feels a lot more fresh and crisp than it does here in Texas.
Nice. Yeah. Fresh air is important.
Yep. We got a link for your stream in the chat. Be sure to check him out. Give him a follow. This will be on YouTube pretty soon. I'm going to highlight it right after today's stream. The previous episode was exported today, so you can watch that if you want to see Confucius Part 1. And thank you very much for your time, EcceFatum.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Nice. Well, that's pretty cool. I like that one. We take a lot of tangents, but I think that's one of the most fun aspects of it. Thanks, chat, for your interaction. I read most all of it. Not all of it was necessarily appropriate to respond to, but we're still learning this format, making new and different content and things like that. Yeah, cool stuff. The Eastern philosophers and things like that I know the least about, so it's like lots of fresh and new things to learn. I think Confucius in the vague capacity is more or less understood by pretty much everyone in the world, which speaks to his legend and things like that. But yeah, the reminder to be virtuous and upright, speaking of which, have good posture. Uprightness is a funny way of talking about it because speaking about it in the moral capacity, but in the context of Confucianism, there's importance in ritual and the way you execute it, because that's a way to practice your uprightness. Sitting upright, for me, I don't know if it applies to other people, I tend to play StarCraft better if my posture is better. I don't know if I'm a more moral and virtuous person when I'm sitting upright. I guess I could test that. But yeah, having to quote yoga, an upward current of energy is an interesting thing to be mindful of. Like thinking of your body being vertical. It's the opposite of being asleep, unless anyone sleeps vertical, which I think is not common.